Everyone, how is everybody doing tonight? Good to see warm weathers. Yeah, same here. I was so happy. I mean, it was in 60s, which was good. I hope it doesn't goes down and it doesn't snows. But yeah, I welcome you all for tonight's meeting for Omaha.NET user group. Coming and speaking in this user group is always fun, and always fun to meet Matt and Brian, and I'm always thankful to them. I feel very humbled. I started speaking actually in .NET user group back in 2017, so Matt was the guy who let me speak for the very first time. I was not confident, but he is the main reason that I started speaking, and I really liked it, and I've still been speaking. So if any one of you have any ambitions to be a speaker, I think you should reach out to Matt. He would let you have that opportunity, and who knows. But anyways, today's presentation, the topic I've chosen is Microsoft Identity Platform for developers. I called developers and not .NET developers because pretty much what I'm going to talk today applies to any developer who uses any programming framework or language. It pretty much applies across the board. But I have some demos that I have taken from .NET so that everyone can relate in this room. So anyone knows what is Microsoft Identity Platform? What is it? Go ahead.
It's a form of security for accessing.
It's a?
Security.
It's security? How is it different from Azure Active Directory?
Active Directory is based on the user, whereas this is permissions based on the identity.
I would agree to you for most of the part, but I would say how I see it is Azure Active Directory is part of Microsoft Identity Platform because they are so tightly coupled. It's very difficult to figure out where is that boundary, where it ends at Active Directory and where it starts with Identity Framework. But before we jump onto that, I know Matt did introduce me, but just a quick intro. I do work at Capgemini as a director in their Global Microsoft Cloud Center of Excellence. Anyone knows Sojeti? They are pretty active here in, I know Matt knows, Matt used to work there, but yeah, so Sojeti is pretty active in Omaha area, and they are one of the business units within Capgemini. I do work in a different business unit. I'm not part of Sojeti, but yeah, pull up Capgemini. If anyone is interested to work for Capgemini, do let me know. I would love to refer you. I have been in Omaha since 2016, and I have been awarded Microsoft Most Valuable Professional Award in 2020. So that has been one of the key achievements that I feel in my lifetime. So that's one thing. And I do run Omaha Azure User Group. I sometimes envy of Matt when I see so many people show up in .NET User Group, whereas in Azure User Group we have little bit lower turnout. So if anyone is interested in Azure, we do run monthly meetings. So you guys can show up and you can check out the website for our meeting updates. And I'm a fan of certifications. I do love cloud giving and appearing for cloud certifications to keep myself up to date, and I highly recommend everyone who is planning to learn anything in Azure should track and learn through those certification learning paths. With that, enough about me. Let's quickly jump onto the topic for tonight, which is identity. So in the past decade or so, the paradigm has shifted heavily towards securing software systems, and the key component that has popped up to the surface is identity. And identity is the new control plane which is recommended to secure any software system. When I say any software system, it could be any cloud-hosted application. It could be any application that you run on premises, and it's just not limited to your applications. You also need to secure your devices. We have smartphones, tablets, laptops, even TVs are smart now, so we need to have security at each of our devices. And then we have users. It could be our employees in our enterprise, it could be partners, it could be customers, it could be end consumers. So we need to have a secure backbone behind each of our software systems so that we can ensure that our security posture is intact in our enterprise. And identity is the new control plane, it's the new backbone for that. And that's where Microsoft Identity Platform comes into play. So before we jump onto that, some of the common questions that most of the developers, when they're working and writing their own applications, they ask is, can I leverage my company's existing IAM solution to save some cost? For example, if they have been using Active Directory or Azure Active Directory or any other identity provider, using that particular provider can certainly save costs. How easy is it to quickly get started and build authentication into applications? Does it support or integrate well with the platform language and tools that I use? The identity provider that your enterprise use might not be it might not provide seamless integration with the programming frameworks that you might have been using. And does it support out-of-the-box features that you can consume in your applications without writing any code? So I still remember when I used to be a .NET developer most of my career, so when I used to work, anyone has used Identity Server? It's a GitHub-based open solution. So we used to use Identity Server as our identity platform, and it was a mess. It took me several months, if not years, to understand how it works. But now when I see Azure Active Directory, so many things are offered out of the box, which is really wonderful to see. So when I say out of the box, there are so many services that are offered through Microsoft Identity Platform, including multi-factor authentication. It does support passwordless authentication. Access lifecycle management is a key aspect which many identity providers are now integrating in their systems. And conditional access is a way how you can control the access to your systems in a conditional manner. And I have a slide for that, we'll talk about it. It does support all the major industry standards and protocols ranging from OAuth, OpenID Connect. It does support FIDO lines, so you can use those FIDO keys to let your users authenticate and sign in without passwords. It does support SAML. So what does it entails to developer? When you as a developer start using, what does it really boils down to? So everything starts with an application registration. When you are starting to develop your application, before you can consume Microsoft Identity Platform, you have to register your application with Azure Active Directory. Once you do that, then it inherently gives you access to Azure portal, and you can give access to your APIs, to your applications, and Microsoft protected APIs like Microsoft Graph. Anyone has used MSAL in their project? Microsoft? Okay. So yeah, Microsoft does provide their authentication libraries for different programming frameworks that you can consume to write your applications. There are different kinds of identities. When you look into any identity platform, one of the questions that comes into mind is, what kind of identities will this identity provider support? To give you a perspective, think about it could be just your internal users, your employees. It could be your end customers who are not on your Azure Active Directory tenant. It could be other applications. It could be any third party user who might be coming through Facebook login or Google, or they might be using Twitter login. And as I was saying in the previous slide, it supports all the industry standards and protocols. This is just a number. I got these slides. I didn't have enough time to work on these slides, but I found these numbers to be very interesting to put things into perspective on how Azure Active Directory is consumed today. So there are 300,000 Azure AD premium organizations. So what it literally means is there is a licensing scheme for Azure Active Directory. You can have premium P1s, premium P2s, which comes with different licenses. So there are over 300,000 premium tenants that exist today in Azure AD. There are 425 million plus Azure Active Directory monthly active users today who log into Azure Active Directory. And then on a daily basis, there are 30 billion plus authentication requests that are being handled by Azure Active Directory, which is huge. So when you look into Microsoft ecosystem, Azure Active Directory is tightly knitted. Anyone remembers before COVID there was an outage with Azure Active Directory? Or Matt, do you remember, was it before COVID, after COVID? I don't remember it. I think it was 3-4 years back. When everything went down, you cannot connect to a Microsoft Office, you cannot connect to Outlook, you cannot connect to Azure Portal, you cannot connect to literally anything. And at that time, the reason was Azure Active Directory was centrally hosted in South Central region in Azure. They had a replica region, but primarily most of the organizations were hosted in South Central, and when that region went down, everything started falling down. But the idea there is to help you understand when you log into services like Microsoft Teams or SharePoint or Outlook, you are authenticating using Azure Active Directory. So since that outage happened, Microsoft did dedicated a team to look into the disaster recovery and high availability aspects of Azure Active Directory. So they did announce 99.99% SLA for Azure Active Directory after that outage happened. But it is now supported globally, so which is a good thing because you cannot afford losing access to your identity provider as it's the entry point. If you cannot connect to your identity provider, you cannot let your users enter any of your systems. So it could be a huge revenue loss. Anyone tracks what Microsoft has been releasing? Heard of what is Microsoft Entra?
Is that the graph replacement?
No. Graph is part of it. So Microsoft, I think starting 2017, 2016 or so, they have been investing very heavily into security space. They have been increasing service offerings regularly. It just started with Azure Active Directory back then they also included Defender services, which is very wide. So the point here is they have been adding these different services. So they have clubbed everything together into this offering called Microsoft Entra. This was, I think, rebranded last year sometime in fall. But it's not a replacement for either Azure Active Directory or Microsoft Graph. They all roll under Microsoft Entra because it's the umbrella brand in which all the security services that Microsoft offers goes and sit. To give you a perspective, it does include Azure Active Directory, but it also includes permissions management. It includes identity governance. Anyone who has some administration background with Azure Active Directory will realize there is a whole world together around identity governance where you can do things like access reviews to see who is logging in, from where they are logging in, and so on. And then workload identities is also announced, I think last year it went GA or so. So that is also part of Entra. Let's jump onto the basics. When we talk about any identity platform, when you are securing your identities, it's very important to understand the difference between authorization and authentication. I assume most of the people present here would know what it is, but I still thought to put this in the slides to keep everyone on the same page. So essentially, authentication is a process of proving that you are who you say you are. If Matt comes to me and says he is Matt Roy, I need a mechanism to authenticate that he is Matt Roy. And this is not specific to an user. It could be a machine, a device, an application. Anyone or anything that claims to be something should be authenticated that it's genuine. And Microsoft Identity Platform utilizes OpenID Connect. I have a slide later to talk about OpenID Connect protocol, but it uses OpenID Connect protocol for handling authentication. Authorization, once you have an authenticated identity, you also need to provide permissions to that identity to perform operations. So if there is a user who has been authenticated into my website, I also have to go and authorize that particular identity to go and perform an operation. So that is what authorization refers to. Microsoft Identity Platform utilizes OAuth 2.0 for handling authorization. So OAuth 2.0 is an authorization framework that enables your third-party application to obtain limited access to an HTTP service. It all works on top of HTTP. If you are interested, I have provided the link for the specification for OAuth 2, which details each and everything about the different flows that it supports, what each of the components in OAuth refers to. You can go and read that. On the same lines, OpenID Connect is a simple identity layer on top of OAuth, because if you are looking at any identity strategy, just having authorization on top of OAuth is incomplete. You need to have a combination of authentication and authorization. If you are plainly using authorization and using OAuth 2.0, your strategy is incomplete. So to complement that, OpenID Connect is a platform which is built on top of OAuth 2.0 to support authentication. And I provided the link for the documentation for that as well. The one key takeaway out of OAuth is the different roles that play inside any communication that happens digitally. So what you are seeing here is 4 different roles. So it all starts with a client who needs access to a resource. The resource sits somewhere on a resource server or a resource owner. But the resource owner or the resource server doesn't have a mechanism to tell the client, that is the incoming client, if that incoming client can access that particular resource or not. So to handle that situation, the 4th component, authorization server, comes into play. So what happens is when a client reaches a resource server or a resource owner asking for a resource, the request is passed on to an authorization server, which validates, which authenticates the client and ensures that the client is genuine and has access to the resource that it is asking for. Once it verifies that, it hands over an access token to that particular client. The client takes that access token, takes it to the resource server or the resource owner, shows that access token showing, hey, I'm a genuine client, I have access to this particular resource, please give me access to this resource. So resource owner happily accepts that token and then provides access to the resource for the client. So that is how, in very basic layman terms, how OAuth works. Now, that piece where the client reaches resource owner sends request to authentication server validates and returns back the token. There are different ways you can handle that particular mechanism, and in OAuth world it is known as flow. And there are many different authentication flows that you can use in your system depending upon what your client identity is. If it's an application, if it's a user, if it's an application who needs access on its behalf, if it's an application who needs access on behalf of the user, what is the resource that it needs access to. So all those different things goes into the decision making of which flow you should opt for. I've included a few flows which I have used in my applications in the past, so I thought it would be a good idea to share with all today. So the first one is client credentials flow. So what you are seeing here is a web application which is hosted on a web server towards the very left. It's trying to access a web API. So it's using a client credentials flow. So what it does is, first it goes and it goes requesting permissions from the identity provider, whether it can access the API or not. And since this is a privileged permission, it needs an admin consent because the API is going to return privileged data. So web server goes to the endpoint for my identity provider, which sends it for the admin consent. Once the administrator consents, it returns response with the tenant ID. Tenant ID is your Azure Active Directory GUID that you can use. Then it goes ahead and sends the request token providing client credentials, which returns back an access token to the requesting web application, and then that web application running on the web server takes that access token and goes to the web API to get access to that particular data. So essentially what, in most basic terms, it utilizes what is known as client ID and secret. You create a client secret for it, you get an admin consent on that, you provide appropriate permissions, and then you use that ID and secret to get your access token, and then you go ahead and access your resource. The next one is implicit flow, implicit grant flow. Before I go to that, I want to talk about auth code. So what happens is, in this case, you have a client who goes to the authentication server, provides its identity. The authentication server doesn't know if the client is genuine or not. It sends an ID token to ensure that the client is right. The client responds back to that. After the authentication server receives a request and approves that, it returns back with an access token, and then the client uses that access token and passes it to the resource to get access to it. The only difference between auth code and implicit flow is, in implicit flow there is no ID token involved. The moment the client reaches authentication server, it returns back an access token right away, and then the client uses that access token and goes ahead and connects, gets access to the resource. Just because it returns the access token directly without validating, or I should say it validates the client implicitly without explicitly asking for its identity, it's not a highly recommended flow that you should be using in your code. One more flow I've used in my application several times is on behalf of. So sometimes you have an application to which you want to give access to the resources to which you have access as a user. So you would like your application to log into your, or not log in, but to get access to the resources that you as a user have access to. In any of the flows that you use in OAuth, it is all token based. So anytime it goes to the authentication server returns back a token. There are three main category of tokens that you should be aware of. It all starts with an access token and ID token. So as I was saying, ID token is issued by the authorization server. It gives the basic information about the client. And then access token is the token which provides information whether the client has access to the resource or not. But you have to remember that these ID tokens and these access tokens come with a timeline. They have a very short life. Mostly it is 60 minutes or so, if I'm not mistaken. And you can only extend it, I think, by, I don't remember the exact number of hours it can be extended to, but by default I believe it comes with a 60-minute lifetime. So after 60 minutes or so, whatever the default duration is, these ID tokens and access tokens expire. So in that case, you can utilize another token called refresh token to refresh your ID and access token so that your clients can keep connecting to the resources they look access to. All these tokens are based on JWT, JSON Web Tokens. If you have not used them, it's built on top of 3 components. It has a header, a payload, and a signature. If you have ever tried to debug your API calls or where you have been authenticated, you would find tokens looking something like this. So whenever you see this, it's a JWT token. You can connect to jwt.io to decode, verify, and generate your JWTs. And if you will decode an existing token, you will see it breaks it down into a header, a payload, and a signature. So the different flows that I talked about, as I was saying, which flow you have to use in your application depends exactly on some of the factors, like what is your client? Is it an app? Is it a user? What kind of app is it? What is it trying to do? And so on. So what I'm trying to show here is if it's a single page application, or if it's a web app, if it's an API, if it's a background or a daemon process, if it's a mobile app, if it's a desktop app. So these are some of the kinds of applications that you might come across for which you might like to have authentication using Azure Active Directory. So this is a chart or a graph that is published by Microsoft. I should have included a link to that, and I'll see if I can get it included later. But whenever you are in dilemma which flow you should be using in your application or in your client, you can always go and refer to this. This will really help you in getting to the right flow that you should be implementing. So as I was saying, MSAL, Microsoft Authentication Libraries. Microsoft out of the box provide different libraries that you can include in your project to get connected to Microsoft Identity Platform and Azure Active Directory to get the identity implementation done. It does support JavaScript, .NET, Android, iOS, Python, Java, Angular, and .NET Core. Now when I'm showing these programming frameworks, not all these platforms support a Microsoft Identity Platform across all the client types. So what will happen is some of these might not support Microsoft Identity Platform on app type like mobile apps or web apps. So you have to go and check the support on the Microsoft documentation before you choose. But for most of the generic cases, I've seen MSAL is available. I've seen developers using it in Angular, in .NET Core. So it's being used across the board. So the best part is you can keep using the programming framework you're comfortable with, because most of the common programming frameworks have MSAL. It's all secure. It's written by Microsoft. They have taken care of all the security best practices, and it does provide secure access to your Microsoft-based identities which are hosted in Azure Active Directory and the federated identities. When I was talking initially, I was saying when you have to use Microsoft Identity Platform, the very first step to secure your application is to go and register your application in Azure Active Directory. So it's basically a step that you can do either in Azure Portal. You can use any of the other management tools. You can go and use Azure CLI or PowerShell to get an application registration created. Once you have application registration created, you can provide appropriate permissions to that application registration, and then you can go ahead and configure your application to use that application registration in your code and get authentication work. Whenever you are creating an application registration, there are 2 fields at minimum that you should be providing: an application ID, the client ID in your code. Whenever you save an application registration, it automatically generates that ID for you. It's a GUID. And then the redirect URI, which is used by the authentication server to redirect your request to another destination whenever the authentication is completed. When you're creating an app registration in Azure, it does ask you what is the kind of application or whether it should sit in single tenant or multi-tenant, should it support personal accounts or not. So based on that, you can create your application registration. So it purely depends upon your application. For example, if it's an LOB application strictly internal to your enterprise, you might just opt for a single tenant. And for the benefit of people who don't know what a tenant is nothing but an instance of Azure Active Directory where all your identities are stored. So whether you want to just use identities in a single Azure Active Directory instance, or you want to use it for multiple Azure Active Directory instances, for example, there might be one for Farm Credit, there might be one for any other organization. Each one of those organizations might have their own Azure Active Directory tenant. So whatever applications Farm Credit is developing will be utilizing only Azure Active Directory tenant for Farm Credit. But that doesn't stop you from going multiple tenants. You can also give access to the users on other tenants. So the good part is if you go through portal, it's very easy to maintain that. It's all in a single place. You can see all your application registrations. I will talk about some of the problems I've seen with maintaining those app registrations and the risks that they pose. But the positive side is you can see all those app registrations at a single place. Do remember that when you are trying to create any of these application registration, there is a specific role in Azure Active Directory that you will need to create those. As a plain user, you cannot create those. If you don't have administrator access, you will have to go and ask for administrator in your organization. But essentially, you need an application administrator, application developer, or a cloud application administrator role in case you want to create an application registration. Anyone knows what is service principal? Is it the same thing as app registration, or is it different than app registration?
Different.
Is it different or same?
It's different because it can be given to multiple resources, right?
True. So to understand service principles, let's take a step back and think about what is a security principle. So a security principle is nothing but an identity, and that identity can either be a user identity or it could be an application identity. So when it's an application identity, it's called as service principle. And there could be three types of service principles. One is application, one is managed identity, and one is legacy that are supported in Azure Active Directory. Application, I was showing you application registration in last few slides. So when you are registering your application in Azure Active Directory and assign permissions to those, implicitly what Azure Active Directory is doing, it goes ahead and it creates a service principal object also for you. So you have two different objects in Azure Active Directory. You have your application object and you also have your service principal object. So that is your application, and then anyone who has used Azure in their projects will know there is a concept called managed identities, where you can assign identities to your Azure services, services which are hosted in Azure, so that they can connect to other services hosted in Azure without a need of writing anything in your code or storing secrets in your code. The third is the legacy types, which I have not come across in my work so far, but it's for supporting anything which was there before the concept of app registration came into being. But as I was saying, there are two kinds of objects when you register your applications. There are two kinds of objects that gets created. The first is the application object, which essentially reflects your application registration, which reflects your application. It stores settings specific to your application, like API permissions, the client secrets it has, what branding you need for your application, what are the different app roles. And essentially it describes three aspects of your application: how the service can issue tokens, the resources that application needs access to, and the actions that your application can take. And these three things are specific to your application that you can register in your tenant. The other kind of object is a service principal object, which gets created, as I was saying, by default whenever you create an application object. Now the application object always resides in one single Azure Active Directory tenant. You cannot have an application object in two different tenants. It will always reside in one, whereas a service principal object can reside in multiple tenants, and you can give access to your service principal object on resources that are tied to a different tenant that I'm trying to show in the diagram there. So the application object, anyone has worked on Azure Active Directory in Azure portal? I'm sure you will be confused always between what is application registration and what is an enterprise application. So to simplify that, always remember that when you go to app registration blade, it reflects all the application objects that you have created in your own tenant. When you go to enterprise application, it reflects all the service principal objects that were created in your tenant, as well as they were created in other tenants, but they have access to applications and resources in your tenant. So your application registrations will always be a subset of enterprise applications. If you'll go and look into enterprise registrations, apart from the service principals that get created along with your own applications, you will also see some of the publicly provided applications like Microsoft Graph, Microsoft 365 applications, service principals, and so on, which I will show you in Azure portal shortly. When you're creating your app registrations, sometimes you also need to implement role-based access control and not plainly hand over permissions to your resources. So there is a feature called app roles that you can use inside application registrations. If you go to Azure portal, you can create an app roles. You can enforce your application to request authentication for those users, and you can assign users to those roles. I believe that most of this will be going above your heads if you have not used these things. But I first want to run through all these slides, and then we'll go to Azure portal. I have some demos also to show. I hope that will help you out. Delegated versus application permissions. The very first thing that I've seen developers getting confused is application registrations versus enterprise applications. Once they figure it out, the second thing that confuses them is the types of permissions that you can give to these applications. So always remember, in Azure Active Directory, there are two kinds of permissions you can provide. It is either delegated or application permissions. Very simply, a delegated permission is when you are delegating your application to behave on behalf of a user, whereas an application permission is when it's trying to use its own identity. When an application needs access to a resource on its own behalf, you provide application permissions. When your application needs access to a resource on behalf of a user, that is when you use a delegated permission. When you give delegated or application permissions, there are different levels of permissions. Some of those permissions are very light. Read something, do something which doesn't impact anything, but there are certain permissions which can be devastating. For example, you can give permissions to your applications to go and look into your Microsoft Graph data, go ahead and read people's Outlook mailbox, go ahead and do operations on user entities in your Microsoft Graph. So some of those are very high risk, and for that same purpose, Microsoft has introduced a concept called admin consent. So you will come across, when you go ahead and assign permissions to your application registrations, sometimes it will need an admin consent. The whole reason is because those permissions are so high risk that they need an administrator to go ahead and provide consent before you can go ahead and get those permissions. Anyone logs in? Have you seen a dialog like this that I'm trying to show on the bottom? whenever you are trying to log in into any Microsoft application. So that this is called as a user content also. So there are, when you assign permissions which doesn't need application content, but it's a delegated permission, it's on behalf of a user. So when you give an application permission to access a resource to which you as a user have access to, that application can still not go ahead and access that resource. So the very first time when you will go and log in that application and it tries to access that resource on your behalf, it's going to ask for your consent, and that is what pretty much this does. And you will notice whenever you get this consent on your login screen, it will also tell you what permissions it is asking for. I'm pretty sure most of the people simply go ahead and click on yes without looking into the permissions that is asking for, which is very, very insecure. So next time when you get this popped up in your screen, please look at the permissions. Like here it is saying that it needs permission, the application needs permission to read my profile. So next time you get anything, it could be right also. It could be anything. So before you click on yes, ensure that you understand what permissions you are giving to that application. I just talked about tenant-wide admin consent. Workload identities is a new concept, and I don't want to go deep into it. It's a part of Microsoft Entra suite of services. But to give you into perspective how Microsoft divides different identities, as I was saying before, is either into a user identity or a machine identity. A user is any human, whereas a machine identity is anything that is coming from an application or a machine. So it could be coming from a device like a mobile or an IoT device or an edge device. In that case, it translates into a device identity. But if it's coming from things like a container or a virtual machine or application or your services or your API, all those fall under what is known as a workload identity in Microsoft Entra world. The whole reason why I put up this slide is because I wanted to put things into perspective for what is a managed identity. So managed identity is a kind of workload identity that, as I was pointing earlier, you can assign a managed identity to your Azure resources so that they can access other resources in Azure without the need of maintaining secrets. There are two kinds of identities. If you have managed identities, if you have used Azure in the past, system assigned or user assigned, the only difference is the system assigned identities share the life cycle of the resource to which it is tied to, whereas user assigned ones are not. You have to manage the life cycle of that since you created it. Conditional access. How many of you have MFAs enabled on your enterprise logins? So by default, that is not enabled for users. Now there is a thing called security defaults in Azure Active Directory which enables it, but it never used to be like that. So to enable MFAs, you need to go ahead in Azure Active Directory and create a conditional access policy where you essentially define that when these users log into my systems, they should go through MFA. I'm just taking an example that it's a condition that I want to apply onto my users to log into my systems. So there could be multiple scenarios like that where you would like to have or provide conditional access to your resources, and you can achieve that in Azure Active Directory using what is known as conditional access. Before we jump onto demo and I show you some code as well as what happens in Azure Portal, there is an API called Microsoft Graph which links everything within Microsoft 365 space and in Azure space. So it includes everything, documents, conversations you are having on Teams, everything ties down at the back end using Microsoft Graph. It does offers an API that you can connect to get your user profile information, to your Outlook mailbox information. You can read and send mails using Microsoft Graph. You can also manage the application registrations that I was showing using Microsoft Graph. And it's all built on top of Microsoft Identity Platform. If you have never played around Microsoft Graph, there's a tool called Graph Explorer. I highly recommend. If you have got access to a tenant, just go ahead and play with it. They provide you a very good interface where you can make different graph calls and get the data from your Graph API. But again, the very first thing you have to do for that is to sign in into your Azure Active Directory tenant, and then it validates what permissions you have, and based on those permissions that you have on Microsoft Graph, you can make some or most of these calls. So I did not created full-fledged demos on my own because I wanted to hand over something that everyone can take with them and play with at their end. So Microsoft does publishes several samples that I have tried to pick up to demonstrate today some of the ideas. And I would share the link also of it. They have included samples across different app types. If you want to integrate Microsoft Identity Platform with your web app, to sign in your users into your web app, they have a sample for that. There is a sample where if you want to authenticate your web app to connect to your web API, there is a sample for that. So I'll go through that GitHub repo as well, and I have taken some of the samples from there to save some time. I have all those set up as well. But before that, I like you to point to the Azure portal. So this is Azure Active Directory. Anyone who is seeing this for the first time? Okay, so when you log in into Azure portal, you can access your Azure Active Directory within Azure portal. If you don't know, you can just go ahead and search for Azure Active Directory from here. Or you can also go ahead in this hamburger and you should be able to find Azure Active Directory down here as well. But once you do that, you don't need to have an Azure subscription to access your Azure Active Directory in Azure portal. So once you log into portal.azure.com, you can go to Azure Active Directory and see that tenant you are part of. For example, I have my own personal Azure Active Directory tenant, which is assigned to my domain name. As you can see, it's vaibhavgujral.com. It's my domain, which is tied to my Active Directory. Here is my tenant ID. So tenant ID is one of the inputs that you have to use to configure your apps. And then towards the left, you will see there are two tabs here, App Registrations and Enterprise Applications. So this is where you can go and register your applications as the very first step. As you will see, I have created several when I was preparing these demos, but you can simply go here if you have right set of permissions on your Azure Active Directory. Since this is my personal tenant, I'm a global administrator, so I can literally do anything on my personal tenant, but there is a very high chance if you are trying to do it in your enterprise's AD tenant, you will not have access to do any of this because of the obvious reasons. But if you need to do this, as I said, you need Azure Application Administrator or Cloud Application Administrator role. But you can go ahead and create any application here, as I was pointing to, that who is going to access your application or whom do you want. Are your identities only residing in a single tenant, or do they reside in multiple tenants? Do you also want to give access to personal Microsoft users like Outlook.com, Hotmail.com, Live.com users? You can select whatever works for your application. I'm going to stick with a single tenant because I don't think anyone is going to use this application outside of my tenant. A redirect URL, where you would like the platform to return back after the authentication and authorization is complete. You can give or you can leave it blank. It's optional, because for some of the app types, you don't really need to provide response URI. You only need where you have a UI, a web-based UI. If it's a web app, if it's a mobile app, that's when you need a response redirect URI. If it's a daemon app, if it's a background app, if it's an API, you don't necessarily need a URI that it should respond back to. And you click on register, and that's pretty much it does. It goes ahead and it creates your application registration or the application object. As you will see, here is the client ID that gets created here. Here is my tenant ID. There is no redirect URI. I can go ahead and add it if I miss to add at the time of creation. There are on the left is all the blades that I want to point out. The very first one is API permissions. This is where you can go and provide permissions to your applications. By default, it has given access to Microsoft Graph, and it has given a permission called user.read. So if I would like to use this application registration in my application and try to make a call to Graph API to read a user, read my information, I will be able to do that. But I can certainly go ahead and add different kinds of permissions. I can give permissions on Microsoft provided APIs like Microsoft Graph or Azure Management APIs. There might be APIs which my organization uses, my organization meaning my enterprise, or there might be the ones which I would have published as a user. So let's say if I go ahead and choose Microsoft Graph, as I was showing in the slide before, it could be a delegated permission or an application permissions. And to reiterate, application permission is where you want your application to access a resource under its own identity, whereas a delegated permission is where you want your application to access a resource assuming your identity. So if I go ahead and choose delegated permissions, I can see, you will see the first one it says is email, view user's email address. So by default, a user can only view his email address and details about his email. That's why it needs to be a delegated permission. Whereas if we'll go and look into application permissions, it will be very generic, which doesn't need a user identity to be proven. So what I have done is, let's go and see the user ones. There are all types of different objects that are provided within Microsoft Graph API. You can choose what you want in your application. You will find things like mails, calendar, chat coming from Teams. You can have all these access through Microsoft Graph. So the most common one is user. You see mail here. You can go ahead and mail.read. You can read shared emails. You can send mails. You can read write is basically you can send emails using a user's identity. And likewise users, I already selected user.read. You can go ahead and select other permissions like user.read.all. When you see user.read, it only reads a single user. User.reads.all can read all the users in your tenant. So I can go ahead and simply choose, let's say, user.readWrite, which gives my application permission to also update my user details. So as we'll see, if I just use user.read, it says sign in and read user profile, user.readWrite, read and write user to user profile. But these are all provided by Microsoft Graph today because these are all Microsoft APIs. You can create your own app roles and scopes for your own applications, which you can create it. Here I have samples to show you, but what I did for user.read and user.readWrite, you can literally do for your own applications. You can give permissions to read, write, and do whatever. I will show you a demo for that. Whatever you do, make changes in your app registration, you can also go and review in a JSON file, which is the application manifest file, which is here. You can directly edit your changes here as well. The other tab that I want you to remember is enterprise applications. So you will see there are a bunch of other applications that are just not limited to the app registrations that I created. So again, to reiterate, these enterprise applications include the applications I have created on my tenant, as well as the applications which were created on a different tenant, but they have access to something in my tenant. And I have provided access to those. So if you are starting to use Azure Active Directory as your identity provider in Visual Studio 2022, it has a seamless integration. When you start your projects, you can include identity in your project without writing a code on your own. So if I go ahead and create a new project, It's taking time. Okay, so I already have chosen a template before for ASP.NET Core app. Let's say if I call it my web app test, and if I click next, in the wizard you will see this authentication type here. I can go ahead and choose Microsoft Identity Platform there and click on create. It will create my project, but then it will go ahead and ask the configuration for my Azure Active Directory tenant. And remember the tenant ID that I have shown here in overview for my Azure Active Directory. Where did it go? Okay, I'm in the wrong place. So you see this tenant ID. So each of your Azure AD instance will have its own tenant ID. If I go back here, it is popping up something for me to configure before it can connect my identity provider. Bear with me, I have multiple instances of Visual Studio running. Maybe that is causing the problem. So as soon as it identifies that I want to use Microsoft Identity Platform, it asks me to install a .NET MS Identity tool so that can be configured with my application. I go ahead and click on next and get it installed. And if I don't use it, it will create a boilerplate application for me, which I can run. It will pop up a web page that I can access anonymously without having any login or anything. So now since I have signed into my Visual Studio instance using the same account I was logging into my Azure portal, which is here, it's already fetching all the tenants I have access to. So I can choose whichever tenant I would like my application to be connected to, which is this one. It will tell me which is the application registration I want my application to be connected to. Remember, I created an app registration in Azure portal. If I don't have one created already in Azure portal, I can go ahead and create it here. The same thing, I can provide it a name. Let's say my web app test and register. This is doing exactly the same thing that I've shown you on the Azure portal, where you can go and create a new registration. It will ask for the similar things like the redirect URL and stuff. So now it's asking me, do I need to add any Microsoft Graph permissions? I do not want to add that. Let's do it. Do I need to add permissions to another API? No, let's pass that. It's saying the API URL to which I want to provide access in Microsoft Graph. So let's take the example that they have provided here, which is a me endpoint which returns my user information from Microsoft Graph. It is slow. But I don't know what's happening. Okay, https graph.microsoft.com/v1.0/me. So now it's creating a client secret for me that it can use to do a client credentials flow to authenticate my request against Microsoft Graph and get my information from Microsoft Graph on my behalf. And go ahead and click on finish. It's going to take probably a few seconds before it gets completed. It will create the app registration in Azure. It will get the secret created in app registration, get my local configuration and app settings updated so that my application can use it. So this is complete. It now shows the status that my application is connected to Microsoft Identity Platform. Let me quickly go and run. And again, this is a web app that I have chosen, but you can choose any app type, and you can integrate Identity Platform on similar lines. The only reason I have used a web app here is because it's much easy to demonstrate the concept. So now it's logging. You will see that before heading into the home page for my application, it has gone to the login screen for my Azure Active Directory, and since I have already logged in into my browser, the session is still active. It didn't ask me to log in into using user ID password, but if I run it in incognito, it will ask me to enter user ID password. But since I was already logged in, now it has thrown that consent for the first time, because the application on my behalf is going to perform something which it says unverified, but it says the permission app would like to maintain access to the data and sign you in and read your profile from Microsoft Graph. So now, since I am a global administrator, I can go ahead and check consent on behalf of your organization. What it essentially will do is, next time if any other user in my organization tries to access the same app, they will not be provided with this consent pop-up. But I don't want to do it, because I want each individual user to give their own consent to their data. So I accept it for myself. So now what it's going to do is, it's going to go to Microsoft Graph, hit that me URL, get my profile information and show it on the page, and that is pretty much what it is doing. So as you will see, my display name is my email address, my given name is this, my mail address is this, I don't have any phone number written there, my user principal name is my email address. So all this information is coming through Graph API. So if you will head out to Graph Explorer and call the same API, you are going to get the same data from there. It's scary. It can get scary, because if you give consent to any application without understanding what access you are giving to, it can be really insecure. So you see here, if I go ahead and run query, this is the same endpoint that it is calling from my application, and you will see it's giving the same display name. I am not signed in into Microsoft Graph. It's getting a sample data, but if I sign in, it will get my own data. But essentially it's getting the same feeds that you will see: the user principal name, the mobile phone, the given name, job title, everything. So the idea is it's very easy and simple to get started if you are especially Visual Studio user. The next demo that I would like to demonstrate is, let me stop this. Is where I have a web application and I want to give access to users in my organization to sign in into my application, which is a web application. This is pretty much similar to the one that I demonstrated just before to access my Graph UI. But to have that happen, what I did was I went into app registration and I created an application there. And the application I had was my web app demo. I went there, I went into authentication. I provided the redirect URIs. As you will see, these are the standard URIs for OpenID Connect, and the localhost :44321 is the address for my application running locally. But if you are hosting it anywhere in Azure or anywhere else, you would have to provide appropriate redirect URIs in your app registration. So what I'm trying to do here is the sign-in URI, the redirect URI, as well as when the logout URI, when the user goes ahead and signs out, that's the URI that it calls for OpenID Connect. So as you will see, it already signed me in using this. So essentially what it's doing is, when I went ahead and signed in, since I was already signed in, it skipped that, but apparently when it signed my user using these stored credentials. It went to Azure Active Directory, delegated the sign-in for my application, and returned it back with the permissions, and it verified that my identity is valid, and it let me in because I have connected it to my Azure Active Directory tenant. I can go ahead and sign out, and it will go ahead and call the URI that I have provided here. The logout URL, this will be called, and it will log out the user. Now this was the very simple starter project where I had a simple application. I did provided my domain, my tenant ID, and my client ID here. There was no client credentials workflow here. It was plain authorization code flow where I get my user validated and let me in the application. But there are different other scenarios. For example, if I want to call Microsoft Graph and do much more operations, there is one that I have where I want to log in into Azure APIs and perform operations on Azure APIs. So if I go ahead and run this and show you quickly what it essentially does, me as a user has got access to a storage account in Azure portal, and Azure as a platform provides management APIs that you can call through anywhere, and that's what I'm doing. I have a web application which is calling Azure management API to perform operation on my storage account. So to show you what I'm trying to do here is, if I go into my resource groups, I created a resource group and I added a storage account inside that, and I have created a container where I can store my files. I've just named it sample containers. Oops. So I need to provide access to myself. So this is essentially what it is doing within my web app. I can authenticate and call multiple APIs. One of the examples is where I'm calling an API to update or upload a file in my storage account. Which is here. When I go here in Blob tab, it automatically picks up there is something goofed up in my storage account. I need to add myself as a storage account data contributor role, and it will let me do it. But essentially what is happening in the background is it's going, and if I go to my Blob controller here, this is the action that is being called when I click on that Blob menu. What it is essentially doing is it is fetching it is going to connect to my storage account using the URL for storage account I have provided here. It's using a user impersonation permission because it's impersonating me as a user. That's why, since I don't have permissions on my storage account, it's not able to go ahead and upload the file. But essentially once it verifies that I have permissions, it goes to this storage account, utilizes Azure Storage Client, the Blob client, to upload that file, which gets updated here. Likewise, there are several other functions that you can perform on different APIs. What I'm trying to do here is enumerate between service management API in Azure and perform several other operations. Let me show you one more example here. So if I go here in tenant, as I was saying, it is performing other operations in my tenant. So it's taking my credentials and it's calling Azure Active Directory Management API to get the list of tenants that I have access to. Remember when I was choosing the tenant in Visual Studio to which I want to connect my application to, I was seeing 4 or 5 different tenants. So that's pretty much what it is doing. It's getting the list of tenants on my behalf to which I have access to. It is also calling the same application, is also calling my graph API and getting everything related to my profile, from my picture to my name to my phone number and everything. The idea here is the first example that I've shown you was a single plain web application which called a single API and it worked. Now in this example, within the same web application, I can authenticate against different APIs and I can make calls to. Let me show you one more example. In this particular example, I am authorizing that a user can add or delete records. The records are currently stored in memory. I have not used a database, but you can certainly extend it to store those in database. But what essentially is happening here is the very first thing it does is wonderful. Let me go ahead and run this. So it's a client service. And there are 2 different projects in my solution. One is a service which is actually performing the operation, and then there is a client which is calling that service. So when I tried to connect the client directly without running the service, it failed, but hopefully it should work now. And I'll show you what it does. So you see that there is a to-do list tab here where it's storing everything in memory, the records that I'm adding, and as I said, it could be a database, but now I can go ahead and edit any of these, and all this is possible because it has authenticated me up front. That's why you will see I'm logged into the system. The identity is already validated. I can go here and say, don't pick up groceries. And it goes ahead and updates the record. The idea here is the possibility is immense. You can use a Microsoft Identity Platform across different use cases. It could be just calling an API, it could be calling a database, storing data in your database, it could just be a background process or worker process. How many of you know there are 2 different products? One is Active Directory and one is Azure Active Directory. So if you don't know, there are 2 different products. Active Directory is an on-premises directory service, whereas Azure Active Directory is a cloud-based directory service, and both of them are very different products, but they both can be integrated. You might have identities in your on-premises systems, you might have your cloud identities in your Azure AD, and you can use a service called Azure AD Connect, which your enterprise might already be doing it, but if it's done, the idea is then you can authenticate in your applications against either of those identities. We just walked through some of the examples, some of the flows for developers, but it's not limited to your custom developed applications. You can utilize Microsoft Identity Platform to achieve single sign-on across your application, software as a service applications, and other systems that you might have. Now, there's a concept called external identities in Azure Active Directory, meaning you have an Azure AD tenant. For example, I work for Capgemini. We have our own Azure Active Directory tenant. I have my own user identity, vaibhav.gujral@capgemini.com. But After that, there are people who are external to our enterprise, our organization. So how do we give access to them? So there are two ways to do it. One is B2B, one is B2C, depending upon which use case you are falling under. But under Azure B2B, essentially, heard of ADFS, Federation, it's pretty similar to that, where you can federate between two different tenants, or you can invite external users to be added to your tenant as a guest user. So if you are an administrator, I don't assume that most of you would not have seen this screen, but in Azure Active Directory, when you are creating a user, you can create a user inside your tenant, or you can also invite an external user to your tenant. It could be your Gmail account, your Hotmail account, or any other user on a different tenant, and those are external identities, and they behave as a guest user, and you can pretty much do same things that you can do with your internal users. But there are situations where you don't want to have external users added inside your directory, but you still want them to have access to your systems. For example, you are deploying or provisioning your services for your end consumers who might be using things like Facebook logins or Gmail logins or their own tenant. You can utilize what is known as Azure B2C, or business to consumer. It creates its own tenant like an Azure AD tenant. Rather than inviting external users to your own tenant, you create a separate B2C tenant where your accounts get added as well as the end customer accounts that you would like to, and it's a completely different implementation. And likewise, like Azure AD, it also supports different credentials. Before I let everyone go, I know we are over time, but when you are working on Microsoft Identity Platform, integrating it with your applications, there are few things that you should always remember. And this is just a subset of things you should remember. I have provided a link that you should review. But when you are creating those app registrations, when you are providing those redirect URIs, always maintain ownership of all those. I have come across so many app registrations where developers have added redirect URIs and they forget to remove it, and the application doesn't exist anymore. Don't use wildcards when you are using redirect URI. Be specific, get the correct custom domains there. For web apps, many times I've seen developers go ahead in app registrations and put unsecure redirect URIs, meaning HTTP their URL. Always use HTTPS. Review and trim all unused and unnecessary. I think this ties back to the first one. Regularly monitor the list of app registration owners. Trust me, I have worked with many clients, and they have to literally spend cycles in reviewing these app registrations because it's very difficult to track who created these app registrations, for what purpose these were created, and whether they are still being in use or not. So it always pays off to be on top of these and maintain a list of who is the owner of this and why it was created and when this needs to be deleted. Implicit grant flow is a strictly no unless your use case requires it. Make sure your application requests the least privileged permissions. If you need user.read, just request for user.read. Don't go for user.read-write or user.read.all. Leverage MSAL. There is these libraries which Microsoft provides. There is no foundation or obligation that you have to use MSAL to connect to Microsoft Identity Platform. You can still use OAuth 2 and OpenID Connect libraries to get connected to Azure AD, but then you have to write all the code, you have to maintain it. Using MSAL, Microsoft takes away all that pain and it's all provided out of the box for you. So try to leverage MSAL whenever possible. Before MSAL came into existence, there used to be different libraries called as ADAL, Active Directory Authentication Library. So if you have applications you're still using ADAL, it's very insecure. Looks like there are many vulnerabilities that might creep into your system because of that. So please migrate from ADAL to MSAL. And there are many situations why Microsoft Graph API is important. I know people might get scared because you can get access to users' data which might be very private, but when you are working on enterprise applications, many times you need that level of user data. So again, there are ways you can go and get that data, but Microsoft Graph API is the easiest way to do it because it's all provided out of the box and you can consume it right away. So leverage Microsoft Graph whenever you can. Identity is a big concept. It's very vast. I was very confused how much I can cover and what I should cover in today's presentation. This is the first time I have taken this presentation, so if you have any feedback, let me know what was good, what was not, what I should get rid of. I will be all ears. But if you are anyone who is really interested in learning more, I think every developer should go and learn about these things. Here are some of the links that I have used in my life, in my career, and I have used for this presentation. I will share this link to the slides. You can get the slides, so don't have to take the pictures if you are taking. I put a screenshot of a book written by a lady. She is based out of Netherlands. She also works for Capgemini. She is an MVP. Excellent book. If you are looking for one place where you want everything for a developer to learn about Microsoft Identity Platform, go and check it out. You can buy it on Amazon. Not a endorsement, but just recommendation because I've read it, so it's very nice. I will let everyone ask Q&A. If you have any questions, I'll try to answer it, but if you are looking for slides, you can scan this QR code and the slides are there. You can download it. And anyone has any questions, feel free to ask me.
Have you done much with IEF, the Identity Experience Framework?
No. Did you?
I've been told to avoid it, so I'm curious if anybody has and what they...
I haven't. Have you used?
Make sure you repeat the question.
The IEF framework, Identity Experience Framework, whenever you start talking B2C, it's you can write custom policies and whatnot, basically extend B2C.
The last time I used B2C was back in 2017, and I don't know if, so the question was around Identity Experience Framework.
No, I haven't heard that.
Yeah.
I've been told to avoid it, but I'm just curious if
I've heard of that term a few times, but I've never explored what it is.
You said it's IEF?
Yeah.
Okay.
If anyone wants to get connected to me, you can get connected to me on Twitter, LinkedIn, and I try to run my blog and YouTube, which is not as much, I'm not able to contribute as much as I want to, but hopefully soon. Go ahead.
So earlier when you were showing auth flows for OAuth 2, I was wondering, does Microsoft or does Azure support CSRF tokens from client to service to ensure that the same client that requested the original token is the same client that receives it for something like sessions?
I don't know.
What was it called again?
CSRF tokens.
CSRF is just like broad term for what. I don't know the actual what it's called in OAuth.
Is that the Pixie flow with it's basically the new implicit flow?
I don't know. I don't know enough about it. I just know that machine to machine doesn't matter, but from a client, the browser to machine, if the client requests a token,
It's kind of sticky tokens, right?
you want to make sure that the same client that requested it originally is the one that actually gets the token
I don't know.
on the redirect.
Yeah, if I understand your question, I think you should probably look at Pixie flow with KC. Something key, something. But that's a newer one.
Something.
That's a replacement for the implicit flow, which has been traditionally used for SPA applications, which is what you're trying to do. Because you're talking about an insecure client talking to a
Yeah, somebody gets you to click a wrong redirect link if they hijack it, and they try to take the token through this interception. But since they don't actually have the CSRF token on the cookie or browser or whatever, then they wouldn't be able to validate.
What does it stand for? Cross-site something. Cross-site.
Oh yeah, cross-site is request forgery. It's like a hash. The server hashes like some type of secret,
Right.
and then only the server knows the secret, so they can validate whether or not the same token comes in. It's one key back.
I'm not sure. There might be some mechanism in Microsoft Identity Platform for sure to ensure
Well,
that.
like the Pixie flow, because in there the client generates a secret on demand, and then it hashes it, and sends that hash to the server, and then the server basically processes it somehow. I'm going to screw it up because I haven't done it, but there's a way
involved in the
right.
exchange.
The client's the only one that's aware of it. It passes the hash to the server. The server maybe hashes again. I'm not 100% sure, but anyway, it's able to verify that it's the same request that it sent to the server and came back.
And I'll check if it can be used in a Microsoft Identity platform or not. Never come across it, never thought about it.
In the portal, that Pixie flow shows up as the spa flow is what they call it. Right. That's basically the Pixie flow.
There you go. That's it. Code exchange.
So yeah, if you are preparing for some of the Azure certifications, Azure Active Directory actually has some of the topics that we covered today. I think in developer exam they do ask about app registration and stuff.
Yeah. Question for Vaibhav? Good stuff.
No one get anything or everyone got everything.
Yeah, I'm sure Vaibhav's obviously active in both the Azure Slack channel and in ours, the .NET one. So reach out to him there. He's good to respond. And
Yeah.
Twitter, LinkedIn, all the
If I don't respond, you can reach out to Matt. Matt knows how to get to me. Yeah, but I'm pretty active on Slack channels. At least on .NET user group Slack, I do check regularly.
Okay.
I've got an example that we're using. It's a little different than this.
What?
We create user assigned identities,
Mm-hmm.
and then we assign them to the VMs or the VM skill sets for Kubernetes. And then in our app config, we give that identity permission, and that's how our apps and our Kubernetes gets its configuration from app config.
And that's how you're using managed entities. Yeah, they're very powerful. I mean, I have not heard of any enterprise where they have said that they don't like managed entities. It's very powerful and takes away so much pain. And I don't know why you're using user managed identities, but I think system managed identities or system assigned identities are.
If you have a skill set, I can see why that might make sense. Because you don't want to have assigned the identity more than once, right? To your resources.
It depends upon, I think, the resource you are trying to access through that identity. As
We
well.
ran into some issues with system assigned, where they didn't always work in certain situations.
I've come across an identity where I think we had the same VM scale set, and that identity needed to be added to the database as a user, so that to an Azure SQL database. And if there were 100 virtual machines in that virtual machine scale set, then you are not going to add 100 different identities in that database. That's where, as Matt was saying, maybe a user assigned identity might be better. You create single identity. I think when we were looking at similar thing at Azure DevOps for something, I don't remember what, for pipelines we came across similar thing.
Yeah, we didn't do that. But yeah.
Right.
Yeah, there's ways to use managed identity from Azure DevOps pipelines as well. I can't tell you off the top of my head.
Yeah, because your Azure DevOps agents can run in Azure in virtual machines. So if you are hosting your build agents in Azure, then you can create managed identities for those VMs and then give access to things like Key Vault, and if you are provisioning or deploying your apps, you can use managed identity.
Yeah, managed identity is awesome. If you're an Azure, definitely learn about it or use it. Okay, we're going to run out of time. So if you have any more questions for Vaibhav, why don't you hang around afterwards and reach out. But thanks, Vaibhav.
You want the laptop?
Can I use your computer?
Yes, sure.
Thank you.